Thanks everyone for joining today and taking time out of your busy Thursday to learn with us about board governance. Today's session is Intro to Governance, which is one we've continually updated to reflect some of the best practices and theory of board governance, as well as the reality of that dynamic in many nonprofits. We love to talk about this topic. So yes, thank you for joining us. My name is Liz Tang. I am the Education Coordinator for Integral.org, and I'll be around hosting, monitoring the chat, doing some poll things. So without further ado, we'll go on to our land acknowledgement. Thank you, Mike. So here at Integral.org, we like to acknowledge that we are based out of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot name for elbow. And this refers to the confluence of Elbow and Bow rivers that run through Treaty 7 territory. Mohkinstsis is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and Kainai, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Good Stoney First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5, which is called Calgary Nose Hill, and District 6, which is Calgary Elbow. So we make this acknowledgement as a recognition of some of the work that we do. And in the work that we do, sometimes there exists a tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within and our efforts towards truth and reconciliation. And we, make this statement as a way to accept some of accept our responsibility to work towards reconciling this tension. Yeah. Thank you. So some housekeeping notes on today's virtual session. We'll have some polls and some questions that you can ask and answer in the chat box. If you have any sort of scenarios, comments, please do open that chat box and we'll pepper them in as we see fit or leave them for the end. And as always, the recording, slides, and other resources will be available after today's session. So very happy to introduce today's facilitator. This is Mike Grogan, President and CEO of Integral.org. And from board governance to strategy development and sustainability planning, Mike has over 30 years of experience where he's recognized for his ability to tackle complex issues and create impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of other nonprofit organizations. So without that, take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for joining us. It is always, certainly as Liz says, a pleasure to have you with us. This is a session that we do quite often, and we spend a lot of time doing board governance here at Integral.org. We do a number of things. We do some strategy work for nonprofits. We do some legal work. We do a lot of governance work. So it's always one of the more fundamental things that every organization needs to understand is governance. And you may have been on a board forever and ever. You may be first time on a board, and hopefully there's something in this for all of you. As we go through this, if there's things that are unclear, throw them into the chat. Liz is watching that. She'll throw them out to me and let me know those things. If afterwards there's things that sort of come to mind you want to sort of more information on, by all means do reach out. It is our job here to serve you. So we're always great up for having a chat with folks as we work through all the things that you work through on a daily basis in your organization. Today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about roles and responsibilities of board members and the board as a whole, kind of work together that way. So governance 101 is what we would call that. Some of the basic constructs of nonprofit governance. We'll talk about that relationship briefly between the board, or not briefly, we'll spend a bit of time on it, I guess, between the board and the senior executive. It is probably one of the places that many nonprofits have that relationship. Some don't, but some aspire to that. So we'll spend time on that because it is kind of both a special place and sometimes a very problematic area. We'll do just to give you some stuff with your own board, some tune-ups, some questions you can ask about how you might change some things in your board. So a bit of a takeaway. We won't go too much in depth, but sort of talk a bit about what you might take back to your board to work with them on some of this stuff. And then we'll give you just a little bit different brief view at the end about a different theory of governance. So beyond the 101 to what we call, or a body of knowledge called governance as leadership, which kind of elevates the role of the board beyond the fiduciary, that basic sort of taking care of things part of governance, to perhaps things a little more higher level and a little longer term. So along the way, again, any questions, throw them in the chat. Off we go. We'll have a few things to interact with you here and there. So Liz will walk you through all that. I do want to start with, though, just a quote to start us off. I like to use quotes in a lot of our stuff. And so this is one from an article a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, to Stanford. And this is sort of starting to evolve the nature of boards. But I love this quote. I love that opening line, that boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. And to me, that just sums up a lot of what nonprofit boards are. I think there's a lot of theory and a lot of sort of practice about what nonprofits should do, but they are a tough model to work with sometimes. They're a unique model. They're not quite like working in a staff team. They're not really like a family. They're not like a group of friends. They're people that you are put together with, sometimes by choice and sometimes by happenstance, that you maybe have an aligned passion with, but not always the same passion. And the way you work in terms of your style, your understanding, your beliefs, your vision for the organization, that's tough to do. So it's kind of like this big three-legged race, if you remember such things, or maybe they still have such things. I don't run them much anymore, but still, where you're tied together at the ankle and you're trying to go a certain distance at a certain speed. And if you magnify that by 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 people, it is the tough part because you only move together. So boards have significant power. In fact, you have all the power. We'll talk through what the legal power of boards have, but you are the legal responsibility for organizations. You hold the responsibility and the accountability. End of sentence. Boards may choose to delegate some of that away to an executive or to a committee, but really it all comes back to the board. But you only act as a collective, and that probably is the challenging thing. We get put into this mix, this unique and curious structure where we have to work only as a collective. Our decisions are group decisions. No one board member has any more power than another board member. We may have different roles on a board. We can talk about some of those, but you work as a collective, and that's part of that challenging or creative or curious structure, perhaps. Boards sit both atop and outside the organizational structure. And that is true and more or less true for most. It should be true for every organization. All boards govern, and you are removed from the day-to-day operation. For smaller organizations where you don't have any staff, you're doing the work itself, maybe you're a little more enmeshed. But you play both of those roles. You wear both of those hats, as we sometimes say in board development. So you have this high-level view where you're taking the longer-term view, looking at the whole organization, and then sometimes you have staff or maybe other volunteers who are doing the work, which are much more on the ground. So we'll talk through some of those things. We'll talk through a little more, perhaps technical definitions, but I like that starting place to recognize that there's lots of stuff here to think about. It is a challenging model. It's a very powerful model, and it ebbs and flows for every organization over time. You may have a great board one year, things happen, you have some shifts, circumstances, whatever, and you got to go back and rebuild a bit. That's a totally normal piece of life for nonprofits. There's no one board that sort of gets it right and stays like that for their existence. So it is an ongoing piece of work, and that probably is one of the big takeaways from this. Say all boards need to attend to their own work. And it's probably something we send to the back burner too often, that we don't really think we need to focus on our own house as a board. I would say it's probably the primary role for a board, and then the other governance stuff flows from that. So we're going to do a bit of a poll. Liz will walk us through this, and it's a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high. It is, how would you rate your understanding of nonprofit government? Holy smokes, haven't even finished asking the question and stuff's coming in here. So I'm going to change the scale. No, it's not. 1 is low, 5 is high. 1 is I'm brand new to this, I need to learn some stuff. 5, I should be teaching, Mike should be sitting down. Hopefully there's lots of those folks on here. And whatever your answer is, it's just kind of nice to see where folks are at. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. Anywhere you're at in this scale is always great. So can you share those, Liz? I can't see the share. So
and we're sharing.
There we go. So a nice range, a few newbies in there. Fantastic. Please do ask your questions. I hope you soak it in. Some folks at the top end and kind of lots in the middle. So again, no real, no right or wrong answer. Good for us to know, though. Good for us to know where the group's weighted a bit. We might spend more or less time on some areas. So thank you for that. There we go. Turn you on. I'm going to give you a little more of a technical definition of a board. So we started with one that was a little more, I think, flowery and got some great insights. This is one from the Professional Accountants of Canada. And if you're looking for great Canadian nonprofit board information, the accountants in Canada have some great stuff. So the CPAC, it's at the end here, I believe. We'll give you some references for that kind of stuff. But they're really good because they're accountants, so they sort of follow rules and things are really clear and they walk you through a progression. They have a whole bunch of resources on risk and on social enterprise, on board governance, on all the basic foundational pieces. They have a series called 20 questions a board should ask about risk or so, all these things. But really, they're updated. They're Canadian, which is always nice. When we put material out here, we'll tell you where it's from. Sometimes you'll see material from other jurisdictions. You got to sort of watch that a bit. Most of the stuff you'll see today is either Alberta-based, and we'll reference that, or Canadian-based. Maybe one or two, we might pull a few things in. But it's important that if you're using some regulatory stuff, this boards do fit within a regulatory framework and you understand where the stuff you're getting is from. So from the accountants, they say this, that the board is responsible for all aspects of the organization, including overseeing its operations and holding management accountable for delivering on the mission. Again, back to that definition that you're in charge of everything. So I think sometimes join boards and say, I'm here for the cause, I'm here for the passion. Absolutely, that's a great starting place for being on a board. What we do need to remember, though, too, is you are the legal authority, and it starts and ends with the board. So sometimes we don't understand that or try to embrace that when you join a board, but this is a fairly major responsibility to join a board. So it's great that folks do it. Good to go in with our eyes wide open to make sure that we're not sort of getting offside with things that we didn't really know about, because not knowing is rarely a defense when you get into sort of regulatory issues. Boards are required to make decisions that are in the organization's best interest. And we'll talk about that a bit more. It sort of comes out of some of the duties of the board, which on the surface sounds like, okay, of course we're going to do that. When you get into the mix of it, though, there are some nuances that's tough because there's not just one there's not just one best interest for the organization. You're going to have to choose from a number of best interests that align with your mission. But you also have to recognize you're doing that as a collective. So this is where it gets to that challenging structure. You're legally responsible. You got to do the thing that's for the organization's best interest. It's rarely clear what that is, and you got to do that as a collective. So those are the things we're going to sort of walk through how you break that down. Okay. Nice transition, flowing in and out slowly. There we are. So roll the board. So when you think you've joined a board, you're acting as a collective, you have some basic things that are pretty common to all nonprofit boards. One is you focus on the whole organization. So your job as a board member, and we think about that opening line of board sitting atop the organization. When you're atop, you can look down and see a lot of things. Your perspective is broad. And that is the role of a board, is to look at the entire organization. Sometimes we join boards because we have an affinity for a certain program. We like the CEO. You may come because you're an accountant, you just like to do books. And those are great. So bring who you are, bring your passion, bring your interests, but you're responsible for the whole organization. So your job as a board is look at everything, not just the first parts of the organization that fit your interest or your passions or your history, things like that. So the whole organization is yours, and that goes back to you being in charge of everything. You work together as a whole. We'll say that a lot of times. This is the collective thing. You work as a whole. There is no one who's got more power or less power in a board. You may have different roles. The chair may have a role and will have a role, usually, in coordinating the work of the board, in coordinating meetings to make sure maybe some of the pieces work. But they don't have more authority usually. They don't have the authority to make decisions. That is a collective piece. So working as a whole, which also comes down to this concept of speaking with one voice. And this is both an internal and an external kind of construct. So for boards that have staff, you want to make sure that the board, if a staff member has a board that they're dealing with as an entirety. They're not dealing with little fragments. So what you don't want to have is sort of people saying, well, part of the board thinks this and part of the board thinks that. That's hard to get your head around, hard to be effective. So you need to be speaking with one voice. Inside a board meeting, around that board table, you may fight it out tooth and nail. You may say, listen, okay, I've got this opinion, you've got that opinion. Great to have that. In fact, it's really good to have that. It's good to have difference of opinion. It's good to have different ways to go. And those tensions, if they're used in a constructive way, can be really, really healthy. But what you don't want is those tensions leaving the board table. So once you left that board meeting, you've said, we are speaking with one voice. If we're talking to our staff, if we're talking to people outside the organization, there is this one voice. The board as a whole has said this. If it comes to the point where you're saying, listen, the board has kind of gone down a path, I can just not endorse that, I can't speak with that one voice, that's perhaps time for you to think about leaving that board. So really important. So you don't have this idea that part of the board thinks this, part of the board thinks that outside of that boardroom table. Boards approve policy and monitor impact. And we'll talk about policy a little bit. You can get a little more in depth in this, but policy is how boards exert their will, how they exert their decisions. So boards do that through policy. So that is a way of, and this doesn't have to be overly hard to do, but sometimes they will say, we want an executive director to do some work. So we will delegate some of our work, our authority, to him. And that is something that's usually laid out, and it's a policy. You may have policies on conflict of interest. We should do things or not do things. You may have policies on how you'll treat each other. Those are great things. And they're just ways of saying, how will we be? What will we do? Sometimes it can get pretty long and complex if you get bigger. Sometimes there's policies we have that sit on a shelf, probably don't do any good. But policies are the way that the board exerts their will in terms of how they will carry out their function as a board. For those organizations that have a staff member, you have one employee. And this is the notion that the board as a collective deals with one person usually. Sometimes you might have a couple, one or two more in there. Arts organizations sometimes have a business manager and artistic director, sometimes have co-leadership ones. Those are rarer. Usually the basic model, a traditional model is, and there's always room to change this. You have a board with a single executive. The organization may have dozens of employees, but that is not the board's responsibility. The board's responsibility is to supervise and monitor the impact of one employee who takes care of the rest. And we'll break that structure down a little more graphically later on so you can get a picture of how this looks. And you try to avoid management and operational decisions. And this is, again, if you've got a senior executive for a large organization, we move into what's called the governance, a governing board. All boards governing, the terminology is not great. But you're always governing. You're always overseeing the organization. You're always sort of setting those longer term directions. For some boards, you get involved in the management of the operations, but you got to think you're wearing a different hat then. You're not being a governor if you're out volunteering in an event. You're being a volunteer for the organization. Maybe the same person, which gets a little confusing, but you are wearing a different hat. For boards that have staff, boards governs, staff, the executive manages the organization, and staff and volunteers carry out the work. So the board is to stay out of those management decisions. And we'll talk through what some of the levels of board decision making should be or could be. But you probably don't want board members picking photocopier paper or saying the font on that report was off. Perhaps you're doing that. You're maybe not focusing on the big things. You want board focusing on those deeper, higher level oversight issues because that's where the board really has the authority and the power to do work. So you come to this collective. You are working as a collective, but you come as an individual. So you don't just sort of show up and say, hey, we're a team. You bring who you are. So as joining a board, you are a director. It's usually the terminology we give to boards. There's some variations of that, but director is kind of the broadest one. And so as an individual director, you have a couple things that you need to make sure you attend to. And these are the director's duties. And in Alberta, we have two that we tend to focus on. These are two fiduciary duties. It is the duty of care. And I'll read it to you because it has some sort of grayness to it, I think. To act with the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise would exercise in comparable circumstances. So that's an interesting one. It's got some fuzziness to that statement, I always find. So to act with the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person would be, well, we all probably think we're reasonably prudent, but what is that? What's that benchmark? Similar knowledge and expertise and comparable circumstances. Some gray area there. So what this means is you need to come prepared. You need to say, I'm going to care for the organization. I don't just care for the organization in a way that's kind of abstract. I come prepared. I participate. I read the materials. I vote. I bring my own judgment based upon my past experience and expertise. So if you are perhaps a social worker on the board and an accountant on the board, you have these two folks. The accountant's going to have far more expertise and knowledge on accounting issues than perhaps the social worker. It doesn't mean the social worker has no responsibility for the financial systems, the financial oversight, that idea that boards focus on the whole organization. But the accountant is going to be held to a higher standard, and that standard is not locked in anywhere, than the social worker. Their expertise and judgment and experience in the financial matters are going to be held to a higher standard. Maybe the social worker has more experience in programmatic things. That standard is there. That's the expertise. So you bring who you are, you come prepared, you put aside personal agendas, and you focus on that whole organization. You're caring for the organization. The duty of loyalty is to be loyal to the organization. This goes back to the concept of boards. You make decisions in the best interest of the organization. This is to act honestly and in good faith in the best interest of the organization. There it is again. This has things like conflicts of interest. So you may have some times that arise when your individual life or life outside the board comes into conflict or potential conflict with an organization's interest. So perhaps you're doing an event and somebody on your staff, one of your board members, maybe even a relative of your board member, owns the event space you're going to rent. Well, there's an argument to be made that that board is going to personally benefit if you rent that board space, that event space. So you don't step off the board. You can declare a conflict of interest and say, listen, I can't weigh in on this decision. I need to abstain from that. If it's really serious, maybe not even involve in those discussions and back off again. If it's super serious, then it's pretty time to come off the board. It's that fundamental. But you declare those conflicts, and that's why we have policies, because policies say, hey, if there's something that's getting in our way of the board, we should probably hear about such things. They don't have to be huge. They don't have to be problematic. They are common. They're not the end of the game, but just make sure we're aware of those things and declare them up front. Sometimes you can abstain from voting. Sometimes you set yourself out. It also means that you're not just loyal again to one program or one person. Sometimes you'll hear folks joining a board say, well, I'm just here because of the founders. They're a great founder. I want to make sure that they're honored or taken care of. Great notion, great loyalty, probably not duty of loyalty. You're here, your loyalty is in the best interest of the organization. So that cannot be divided. And that's where it gets challenging sometimes. I'm not here to support one program or one person. I'm here to support the organization. This also has aspects of holding confidential information in being confident about that, or confidential about that, sorry. Sensitive information. You make sure that things that belong to the organization stay within the organization. You're not sharing that back out there again. So not necessarily super hard, but we do bump up against this sometimes. It is hard to know what is in the interest of the best interest of the organization. So things to sort of think about. Policies help this way. So the expectations and norms and the way you're going to be are really clearly defined within this. Where this area gets a little challenging sometimes if you have boards where people are appointed to a board. So for many nonprofit boards in sort of the social service or arts or environmental or sports realm, people join them out of individuals because I just want to support something. There's other boards, though, that have people appointed to them. So sometimes governments might appoint people to a board and say, my representative is this, or industry. That's a tough one, because if you're working for the government, you're appointed to a nonprofit board, where does your loyalty lie? Does it lie with the government, your employer, and you've been doing this as part of your job, or does it lie with the nonprofit? We're slowly moving away from some of that because we realize there's a problem with that. There's still lots of those out there. So those are things that boards that have that type of composition, that kind of structure, really need to attend to in their role description and that kind of stuff, because it can get fairly problematic. And just so you know where this all comes from, we don't just sort of make up where your authority comes from. It comes from rules and laws. So you're largely, there are a couple different acts in Alberta. There's the Societies Act, then the Companies Act. That probably accounts for the vast 90% of nonprofits. About 30,000 nonprofits operating in Alberta right now. Most of them fall with one of those two acts. There's the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, a little more modern act, starting to get some traction. But you'll see there's an act out there. The government has said, hey, there's great things in society we should happen. We need to give these people some protections. And so we'll create these acts. So you have this big act that gives you that. You don't need to go read that. It's there. You can if you want, I suppose. I never have. I'm sure it's good. But you sort of, that gives you the broad laneways. Then under that, we start these things called nonprofits. You have objects. These are the things you're going to do. This is for why you've been formed. You're going to do this. You're going to feed people who need food. You're going to put on sports programs for kids who want a sports program. What are objects? These are kind of the things we're really used to in nonprofits. This is what we do. Bylaws, these come with when you incorporate. It can be called articles, it can be called bylaws, depending on the act. But this sort of tells you the big rules of how you're going to work. It tells you who's going to be a member, how members come and go, perhaps, we're going to store records, all these things. These set the really broad laneways for functioning within the regulatory framework for an individual nonprofit. Policies are how you do their work. So we get down a little narrower. This is how boards do their work. You have governance policies that talk about the board, operational policies that talk about staff and operations. Narrows it down a bit more. The rule is the act doesn't change much. Your bylaws should be kind of baked in, change them, look at them every few years. Policies can change quite frequently. They're more internal. You don't have to call special meetings, things like that. So there's things you can adjust and adapt as you move forward. And the procedure is really just how you carry things out. So it's a really broad from the act down to, yeah, we'll file documents this way. There are some structures, some best practices that underlie all this. And some of the documents at the end will give you some more ideas where to go for that. Or if you're looking for some more information, we can certainly fire it off to you on a one-off basis. So some things you need to think about being a good board, understand and practice good governance. Doing sessions like this, there's lots of folks doing governance, fantastic you joined us, but make sure you understand governance. Sometimes we'll ask folks, how long have you been on board for? Been a lot of boards, and people say, I've been doing board work for 20 years. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes you've been doing it kind of marginally for 20 years. So understand what governance means, but understand what it means in the context of your board. I sit on a board, I work for a board, I teach governance. Each one of those contexts is different. What I'm talking now, I'm talking about the theory of this. The reality kind of is a bit more gray than that. But recognize that it's different for each board, and for each board to spend time again on their own development, their own house, their own being a board. And we'll give you some tune-ups for that later on. That is probably the most underdeveloped part of the governance model here in Alberta for sure, anywhere, I guess. But to take care of your board self-governance. Boards focus on the long-term sustainability. There's times when we're kind of down in the weeds and looking at what's going to happen today and tomorrow. But the primary role of a board is to say, where are we at in 1, 2, 5, 10 years? Those are the questions we need to wrestle with. And that's a little more abstract, a little harder, but there's some great ways to do that. Making sure you have strategic directions and that will further the mission. So part of the board is to say, how are we going to get from A to B? A is where we're at today. B is some point in the future. The strategy is those pieces in the middle. So the board is not just the next program, the next event, the next fundraiser. It is that longer term. That longer term can be whatever you want it to be, strategy from getting from here to there. Hire, guide, and direct and evaluate the senior executive. Again, we've talked about that. If you've got an employee, that's the board's employee. They have the rest. If you're using policies, which you should be, even just a few or a handful, make sure they're up to date, they're relevant. Sometimes you get policies that no one's looked at for 5 years. A lot of times you can put policies on the back burner and it doesn't, when things are fine or no one's sort of upset, policies don't matter. Where things become really problematic, both in policies and bylaws, is when things go south and someone's disgruntled and someone's got a problem, they go back to a policy or bylaw and it says we should have been doing this and we haven't been. So better to be a little proactive on that, make sure they're updated, make sure your policies are good, make sure your org charts are all updated, things like that. If you're going to smooth sailing, probably not a big deal. Stuff gets a little choppy in the water, that's when that stuff becomes really important. And better not to be fighting a bad policy in a sort of conflict situation than having a policy that's perhaps a little more up-to-date and relevant. Again, to tend to your own continuity, recruiting and developing board members. It is a team, right? It's a team you got to attend to and build and develop over time. Make sure you got the new people coming in. Orient them well. Don't just say, here, welcome to the show, figure it out yourself. Taking time to really onboard and welcome and bring people up to speed. For a lot of organizations, it probably takes a year or two sometimes for board members to really be solid board members. It's not something you get in day one. You've got to learn the culture, the style, what the organization does. So this is a development process, and not to have, you can have huge expectations, but recognize that sometimes it takes a little while to get up to speed on a board, for a board. And the last one is something that's really important, I think, for boards, and it's a role that board members play that's perhaps different than staff, is to be an ambassador for the organization. Part of your work is to be out there saying, look at us. This is the great work we do. This is what the change we're making in community. This is the services we're offering. These are the creative things we're doing, whatever it might be. And boards have a different, I think, voice in that than perhaps people who work for nonprofits. So I work for INTEGRALIntros. I'm the CEO. If I talk about CEO, or INTEGRALIntros, I do quite often. It's great. I'm glad I do that. I do that as a great part of my job, I think. But it's different if my board chair comes with you and says, this is why I'm involved. They're a volunteer. They are a community member. Their voice resonates a bit differently because their motives are not perhaps the same as mine. And so I think board being ambassadors and being volunteers for organizations, really a powerful and effective voice, and one that I think we should be. Part of the job of being on a board is to say, I am about this board and I'm here to promote what this board does in a consistent way. Goes back to some of that policy work, maybe more of a communications thing, but if we are ambassadors, make sure we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, not just sort of making stuff up as we move forward and all this stuff. So you have these 3 levels. So the overall structure of a board is this. You have governors, directors, boards of directors, similar language. That is the highest level. Legal and moral responsibilities for the organization sits there. They may delegate some of that away. They set the tone for future development, strategy, and sort of fiduciary oversight. Management, they're the ones who organize things. You may or may not have that role. In some groups, we're going to kind of have a hybrid model. There is some function that allows you to sort of that executing role, that senior executive role. Sometimes that could be an executive committee, maybe it's an operations committee if you don't have staff, or you don't have senior level staff. And then down at the bottom level, not bottom in any sense of importance, but in this hierarchy, implementation, staff and volunteers, getting the work done, those are the ones working on this stuff. So high, board at the top, staff flow from that model. This would be a traditional model of board governance. Some of the things we see right now in nonprofit issues is sort of the lack of clarity on roles, responsibilities, both of the board as a whole and individual board members. I would say I've probably yet to see a board where the roles and responsibilities are really well understood across the entire board. Each person may think, I know what I'm supposed to do, but the other guy's got the problem. Well, probably not the best way to go forward. So role clarity and being saying, I'm doing this. This is what I'm going to do. It's how I'm going to do it. Here's the documentation that backs up my role. So we're all clear. I'd say this is the number one issue. And I'd say every board suffers from this in a greater or lesser degree. And there are challenges of engaging and utilizing the skills and expertise of board members, especially as you get bigger and perhaps have that staffing component in place. Because once you started getting away from the operations, board members often think, well, what am I supposed to be doing? If I'm not picking photocopier paper, what's really my job here? I'm really good at that stuff. Well, there's other things to do. So how to engage board members in an appropriate way to make sure we're using their skills and their expertise. Sometimes it's poor and fractured relationships. I think COVID was tough on folks. I think we're not quite through all that yet. And so some of the cracks were there, maybe got magnified a bit, and maybe it's even beyond COVID. But you've got people working together. People are people, and we don't all click with each other. So you will see relationships that fracture, and that does get played out in an organizational construct, just like anywhere else. I think recruitment and engagement of board members, we won't do a poll on this. We could have just, are you having trouble recruiting board members? I think recruitment of board members is tough right now. COVID was tough on volunteers. I think it's still, we're not out of that yet. I think that the idea of joining a nonprofit board is still, we still have lots of people to do it, but it's declining over time. It's a generational thing where people don't join boards for decades anymore. You sort of move and come and go to different causes, and even working within a nonprofit is not the only way to express your desire to make change in society. And then getting things done. How do we structure ourselves? How do we make sure the structure we have fits what we want to do? This can change over time, committees, the different terms of reference, the meeting kind of stuff. Sometimes we sort of do things, we've done that way forever. We've always had this kind of committee. Well, maybe we can take a look and say, is there a better way to do things as the world evolves? So sometimes getting locked into old patterns, old styles can really sort of hinder the effectiveness of our organization. To talk a bit about board staff here for a second, because this is an important relationship. And even if you're not at the stage yet as an organization, all organizations aspire to, good to know some of the things that we think about are important for board and staff. I'm going to skip forward here, so I'm not going to do a little cloud there with this. Just a couple things that we need to sort of think about in this. The executive, again, if you have that single executive, they're executing the strategy and managing the operation. Okay, so from that big higher level stuff to getting it done, the person who coordinates that usually is the senior executive. Can have different titles, CEO, ED, general manager sometimes. So these are kind of the common ones. It'll oftentimes the external voice of the organization, the face of the organization, to be out there building and sustaining relationships with external stakeholders. Not exclusively, you can spread that around a bit more, but quite often you find that senior executive that's the person who represents the organization, which both has some ups and downs of that. You don't want too locked into one person. If they leave, you'll lose your identity. But they're saying that they're the person who's running things. So they are the appropriate person usually to be out in community, sort of ringing the bell and sort of waving the flag for your organization. Reporting back to the board, part of the duties of the board, the executives report back to the board, strategic operational matters, preparing budgets and operational plans, pretty standard. Sometimes the budget can be done in conjunction with the board, but it is part of the executing of the organization. Supports the development of the board. So it's not the senior executive's role to develop the board, it's the board's own responsibility, as we said, but to support that, to say if they need information, if they need access to materials, if they need training support, things like that, we can facilitate that, still their responsibility. And the last one kind of separates it about this clarity again, saying request consultation and support from the board members in their individual areas of expertise. The important thing here is this is driven by a request. This is driven by the senior executive up to the board. So if I have somebody on my board and I've got some HR issues and they're an HR expert, I may say, hey, can you give me some guidance on this? I'm tapping into your individual abilities, but I'm driving that. It's less appropriate for that board member who has HR experience to sort of come back to me and say, hey, Mike, I think you got some HR issues. I'm going to give you some advice. So it's a bit of a push-pull thing. It's the request from the senior executive up to the board, not the raining information down from on high that makes that kind of work a bit better. So what you can expect, so the role of the board in this one is the board, it sets the overall direction. They do oversight, ensuring you have resources. Those are the big buckets for the board. Overall direction strategy, we'll talk about that. Oversight, fiduciary duty, taking care of the assets. Resources, making sure you have the people and money to do it. Those are the three big buckets for the board. The big buckets for the senior executive are executing, carrying out those strategic directions, planning, implementing, overseeing the activities that way, and informing the board of where we're at that board role and monitoring. So those are the really big distinctions, I think, between functions of the board and the staff. There are some differences, though. We are individuals. We're people. We come to this thing. We have very different backgrounds sometimes. These are general. They won't necessarily apply in all circumstances. But the board acts as a group. Staff act as individuals. We are individuals hired for an organization. The board is a continuous entity. The board is here until there is no more organization. There's not the last board and the next board. There is the board. Individuals will cycle in and out of it. The board is an entity, a legal entity that exists until the organization winds itself down. Staff are temporary. We work at the will of the board, and staff below that work at the will of the senior executive. So we come and go, and that is the model, and that's the reality of the world. Is the board is here forever. We're here for as long as the board wants us to be. The board's a continuous entity. The staff are temporary. Boards are elected or appointed, so members elect or appoint the board. Staff are hired. There's a remuneration there. It's contractual in that sense. Boards are voluntary. You come and go. It's your choice to be here. We're employed. The boards have this orientation towards the future where staff are more focused on daily or sort of closer level operations, but there's some nuance to that as well. The board can assign authority. The staff can receive it because the board has all the authority. I have no authority of my own, even though I have some of my job description. That has been assigned by the staff. Board sets policies. We enact that. And boards are generally lay people, and staff have more professional experience. Now that's a gray area too. It doesn't mean the boards don't have some passion or expertise. You might be an artist in an arts organization, so you are a professional in that sense. But what we're seeing is changed over probably 20 or 30 years in the nonprofit sector is this professionalization of the sector, where people are in functionaries like fund development or accounting or programmatic skills, or in the executive side, the leading nonprofits. There is a body of knowledge and discipline that is a professional set of disciplines for nonprofits. So we do see that division starting to pull apart a bit more, where boards come to us as community members with some interest or some experience in an area. Board staff members are really professionals at building and running nonprofits. So a bit of a difference that way. One of the challenges you see sometimes is the theory of is speaking with one voice. So if the blue dot is the senior executive and the green dots are the board, the theory is that you have this single person who deals with the board, that it is a collective, that it's functioning well, that it's doing its job. The reality is most boards don't function quite that way. And you got something like this, where you've got some boards who are sort of attending meetings, the ones we sort of interact with. You've got a few board members, one board member never shows up, and other people sort of do their own thing. So you tend to get this weird dynamic sometimes with the board-CEO relationship, where the CEO is not quite sure who to relate to. Is it this collective that's not formed, or is this kind of fragmented group? So that's the idea. It goes back to why boards need to focus on themselves in order to have these effective relationships. If you have to function this way, you've got 5 or 6 relationships to navigate. That's really challenging for any senior executive, and pretty challenging for an organization to function really effectively that way. One of the problems we have is that this is again from a Stanford article, is that there's sort of 2 challenges that boards have. Is that is how do you have enough involvement to make decisions? It is that a lot of times boards are in charge. They are in charge of the overall responsibility, but the strategy of the organization. But how do you make decisions if you're not involved in the day-to-day? And you end up with this sort of dilemma where either the board is sidelined from any decisions because they just delegate that to the CEO and say, well, you know what you're doing, off you go. A lot of boards do that. And what the challenge is, if you lose that CEO, you're in trouble. But you're also not fulfilling your duties. You're not fulfilling the oversight duties. So you can't just sort of say, we trust you, off you go. The converse of that, though, is that boards make ill-informed decisions. So, okay, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm still going to decide. I'm still going to exercise this power I have, but I'm doing it inappropriately. So this is kind of the challenge. This is why this partnership is super, super important. So you don't have a CEO is going off on their own direction and a board is sitting back, but nor do you want a board that's sort of making decisions that are ill-informed. And so this relationship is really, really, really important. And it comes down to this fundamental relationship, where this is probably the most, I think, critical aspect for any organization, is that board and CEO relationship. You have that model. Attending this, developing this, it changes over time. As you change the CEO, change the board, but attending to that relationship, like all relationships, it takes work. So that confusion over individual responsibility, that's a common reason why this, what I'm supposed to do and what you're doing, the way of doing it, things like that. Attending this relationship, super, super important. Because this does come down to a theory of shared leadership. And shared leadership is it's a style, and for a lot of boards, this is the structure behind it. You share that leadership. But it comes down to the notion that my success depends on your success. That is the heart of shared leadership. Boards cannot be successful if the CEO is not successful. The CEO and the organizations are not going to be successful unless the board is successful. So that idea there is a vested interest in a way that we need to support each other's growth and development in an aligned and sort of constructive manner. I'm going to jump forward a little bit here because I'm probably 6 hours behind on my slides. Actually, I'm not doing that. Oh, go. So what the senior executive effective the board, speak with one voice, attend to their own process of culture and developing effective governance, take care of their house, to support management decisions. So if I've been sort of entrusted to do the work, what you don't want the board to do is say, well, I don't know that Mike should have done that. You can tell me that privately. In board meetings, fair enough. But to not, if we're going a direction, there is support required from the board. To set those clear and attainable performance expectations, the board does supervise the CEO's work to make sure that we're clear about that. You are employers. And sometimes we sort of think we're a board or this, but you're actually an employer. So there's basic employment principles, both on the legal side and sort of the human resource side, to say, this is what we need to do to make sure we get the best out of this employee. And that honesty, openness, candor, and respect. If there's gamesmanship, if there's hidden agendas, all that kind of stuff, that's tough for any executive to work with the board. Conversely, though, there's some expectations that the board should expect from senior executive to be kept informed on information, events, insights, even ones they don't know that they need. So boards that are in the dark rarely make good decisions. Organizations, boards that get surprised, the worst thing you ever do any board or any supervisor is to surprise them and say, hey, should have told you this a while ago, we got a problem. Proactively, regularly, constructively, effectively informing your board is really, really important. To be treated as a collection of equals. You may not have the same relationship between an executive and the entire board. You may not like some of them, but they are equals. They are a collective, they're equals, and they need to be treated that way. So you can't just say, I'm going to work with people I like and ignore people I don't. That's not honoring the board structure and the board authority. Boards need to be supported in their decision making and collective decision making. This is really important. So sometimes I may disagree with my board. Now that's fair enough. They may think we're going one way, I'm going another way. End of the day, their way wins. Hopefully we've worked through that and constructive and we sort of come to some common ground, but they're in charge. I mean, there's just no way around that to say, I may think I know better. I may well, in fact, know better. It doesn't particularly matter. They're still in charge. And so when they make a decision, there is a respect and a duty to support that. And if not, then perhaps it's time for me to go wander and find something else to do. To support the board's developments that they can expect from me, but not to do it. And again, that sort of parallel sort of expectation, honesty, openness, candor, and trust. I'm gonna give you a quick exercise. This will be in the handouts, and it's just a way of doing some board tune-ups. We do this when we do board workshops one-on-one with individual organizations. It's to tune some areas up. And every board needs some tune-ups. There's just no doubt about it. No matter how long you've been around or whatever it is, there's always some areas to tune up. So we sort of focus in a few different areas. The capacity of the board, the connections between the board and the staff and the community, and the culture of the board. And so when you sort of think about this, these are some questions you can go back to your board with and say, well, how do our board capacities? And what capacities do just mean the capacity to do your work. So the people you have on your board, the processes, the roles, the time commitments, all those things are kind of structural or things that make up the ability to do your work. How effective are those things? Do we need to change things up? Are they serving the work we want to do? Are we sort of finding a lot of tensions that arise because people don't show up for meetings or they don't have clear roles? Those are some things you can tune up. So take a look at some of those areas. And we usually use a basic construct for this, saying what can we continue doing that's working well? What do we stop doing? What do we add to the mix? Nothing magical about that. But how meaningful are those connections? That second area you can be asked yourself as a board. How meaningful or effective are the connections between the board and the CEO or the community? So all this work is a team game. Inside the board, board to staff, staff to community, that kind of stuff. So how effective are those communications? Do we have enough knowledge? And connections can be written quite large here. It can be about information. It could be about understanding things. But how connected are we to each other and to the work and the people who do the work with us and the information we need to do that? And the last one is culture. Have we built the intentional culture of this board? If you're going to be an effective board, there is a board culture. They will look different from organization to organization. What are the expectations? What are the norms? How will we treat each other? Sometimes you get thrown into boards and you start doing things. You think, well, to be a really effective team, you probably got to do some of that team dynamics. So the board culture is something that's probably ignored a lot, but super powerful. I sit on a board that has very few structures, almost no policies, and is super effective. I mean, it's gone through a capital fundraising campaign, negotiated deals with governments, but the culture of the board is so strong. There's a trust there, and we built that over time. Sometimes we get too protective of that. We just want to hold on to the culture. We got to open ourselves up to new ways of being. But sometimes that culture piece can magnify your work if you're weak in other areas or haven't attended to those things, but also just as easily can just sort of dismantle the work of the organization, because a board with great capacities and maybe some good connections and a poor culture doesn't tend to go very far. I'm going to just give you briefly, before I wrap up, and answer any questions that may arise from all this stuff. I realize there's lots, as I walk through, there's lots of information here. So if there's anything that's unclear, again, just fire a note off at the end and we'll sort of get some more information or clarify some things if we've gone too fast for all this. But the stuff I've just talked to now is kind of governance 101. That's kind of the basics of governance, very common. I think every board should go through that every year because things do change, and developing that common understanding of basic governance is really important. Does no good to, if I understand it one way, you understand it a different way, having that common understanding of what the basics are and how it relates to our situation, super, super important. But a few years ago, well, like 10 years back, a little longer than that now, a book came out called Governance as Leadership. And it was based on the premise that, we probably focus too much on the idea of boards being just a fiduciary duty, having fiduciary duties. I'll explain that a little more clearly here in a second. But the governance discussions have focused on fiduciary duties, that's the taking care of the assets, and governance boards primarily as interests of accountability rather than agents of change. So the argument was we've got too much into that oversight role. We're playing traffic cop. We're not really using that thinking power, that strategic power of a board, which is also super important. So they conceptualize sort of three interrelated modes of governance they put out there. One is fiduciary duty. This is the basic stuff. So it doesn't preclude anything we just learned about. It is fiduciary governance is the basic part of governance. So we can't get away from that. It entails taking care of the assets, overseeing audits, budgets, risk management, and executive performance. All the stuff we did talk about. It doesn't go anywhere, sort of pillar, bound, foundational level. In this mode of governance, we have the roles are really clearly defined. The board does this, the staff does this. We know what we're supposed to do. Again, that role clarity is super important. This is a necessary and essential part of governance, but it probably does limit the board. If all you do is think about the financial statements and next week's event and those sort of whatever is sort of coming up in the next little bit and making sure we're okay, yes, important to do, but you probably don't stretch yourself a lot because you're always thinking from one crisis to the next or one event to the next or one day to the next. So if you're only in this role, you don't really sort of stretch yourself, you don't grow. And that can be okay. We don't want you to grow, but to recognize that there is a limit to the fiduciary part of governance. So the next level up, and this is something we've talked a bit about, and I don't think it's a surprise, is a strategic governance. The idea that deepens the engagement of the board to sort of the organizational mission and purpose. Where are we going to go? So we're going to be in 3 or 5 or 10 years or 2. It doesn't matter how long the time frame is. We're not just thinking about today. We're thinking about the future and coming up with some plan, usually in conjunction with the staff, to how we're going to get there. That's what a strategic plan is. Getting from A to B. A is where we're at today. B is some point in the future. What are those many routes we can get to that place? That's essentially what a strat plan is. In this level, if the board sticks to governance, they are part of that process. They're probably more on the concepts and broad directions where the staff will implement these things. This is very much a shared model, I think, usually. This is a partnership. This is why that relationship is so important. The board with the authority and oversight role has to be involved. The staff with that subject matter expertise and on the ground experience needs to be involved, so it becomes a partnership. This is where we need more information. We go back to that concept the board's not having enough information. So when we're doing this kind of work, this strategic work, boards need to be informed. They need to have the knowledge, the understanding of issues, understand, okay, if we are expected to say we're going to get from here to there, I need to make sure that's an informed decision, not just a one that's off the top of my head or fits my own passions. But the third level is this, and this is it gets a little more abstract. This is one you spend all your time on. So this is one that gets us to what's called generative governance. And this is kind of out there. This is sort of sense making about the future. This can get into existential questions. Do we exist in a few years? Is the market for our services growing or declining? Should we merge with another organization? Maybe we're not sustainable. Maybe we need to make some bigger decisions. So it can sort of blend into strategic stuff. It's not necessarily, there's not sort of clear lines between all these things. But these are ones where we're starting to think, okay, what really do we want to do in this world? And is this organization the best way to do it? One of the challenges that boards have is you come in mandated to sort of maintain and sustain and build an organization. And that's a great way to do it. You have that responsibility. That is part of fiduciary duty. Another way to look at it, though, is you're responsible for the cause. Your goal should be on the purpose of your organization. We want to feed people. And the organization becomes a means to that end, not a means to sort of sustain in and of itself. So generative questions ask like things like that. They ask questions of, is this the best way to make the change in the world we want to make? This gets kind of sort of in that this is no one right or wrong answer. You don't sort of have a generative discussion and come out of it saying, now I know where to go forward. This puts a lot of options on the table. This is stuff like scenario planning or asking questions that are kind of wicked questions you don't have an answer to. And the point is not to get to an answer, is to sort of wrestle with, in a thought process way, where are we going to go and what's really the big question we're trying to solve here? So these are kind of thought provoking, they're creative. There's maybe more questions that arise. It's annoying for some people, for sure. If you're linear and want to get stuff done, this is not a great process. Still probably a valid one to do. There's pieces where you start to think this way, it can help the day-to-day. So something happens, you think, you can ask questions, what would happen if we lost half our funding? That's kind of a generative question. Better to ask that before you lose half your funding, and I hope you don't ever do that, but still lose the funding, not ask a question. But the idea that if we ask these questions in advance and have a conversation about them, we're not trying to just predict what's going to happen, but we're exercising that muscle, saying, what would we do if this happened? And you get used to sort of building out different scenarios in your mind or as a board. It takes time to do this. I don't think you do this all the time. You don't sort of do it every board meeting, but it's a good exercise for a board. Quite often during strat planning, we'll throw business on the table, get boards thinking that way. This can be challenging for executives and staff to do because they're building the day-to-day. They don't want to be thinking about the future necessarily. They're doing well. They're proud of what they do. But there's certain organizations. We did some work with some gas producers, co-op natural gas producers. And one of their generative questions would be, well, do we exist in 10 years? I mean, will fossil fuel markets just be so different that there's no need for our services? If you're a group that's working in seniors care, you're thinking, hey, there's a lot more stuff happening out there. There's sort of causes that rise and fall over time. So you're going to think that kind of stuff through. You don't work within the vacuum. Okay. So there's the board has a great role in all this stuff. This is where boards play really well. They have the power, so you can sort of work with all these realms. There's plurality. You have these voices. What makes a board work really well? This is the magic of nonprofit boards, is that unique and curious structure is you get sort of thrown into a mix with 5 or 6 or 10 people who are really different. If you can harness that plurality, those perspectives, those different views, those different ways of perceiving the world, that's when you become really effective. When you don't just sort of let the dominant voice speak or sort of doing things the way you've been done in the past. If you can harness the voices and thoughts and opinions of individuals, that is where boards really shine. Hard to do, takes time. Again, that's why culture is so important. And position. Boards sitting outside in a top organization can start to think longer term because they're not necessarily doing the day-to-day. So you may think that through. There's ways to do it. There's sometimes, you can say, am I working as a fiduciary or in strategy or in terms of the general stuff? But sometimes things can happen to you. And so pretend this is your office. And you came to the office one day, it's your nonprofit's office. There's a giant hole in the roof. And so there are ways you can use incidents or things that arise, whether they're the sort of hole in the roof analogy or the things that may arise on a day-to-day basis. But there are questions I might ask myself. Well, what's the fiduciary question? I may ask myself, well, is everybody okay? What's going to cost to fix this? Do I have insurance? Will our programs be stopped from this big hole in the roof, whatever caused it? Those are great fiduciary questions. Strategically, I may ask myself, okay, what's the opportunity here, perhaps? Do we need to put it? We're planning on doing this expansion, doing a second story. Is this part of the time to do that kind of stuff? Do we need to shift our geographic location because there's meteorites or something in this area? We need to move that to do different work over here. So we can ask ourselves questions, say, what's the strategic question? There may be a generative question that arises from this, saying, do we really need office space anyway? If the world evolves so much to online and hybrid work, do we need to maintain the office? So it's not there's a right answer to that, but it forces you to answer questions or look at things in a different way. So that's why I do like this style of leadership. It gets you out of the weeds. It allows boards to flex that thought and strategic muscle and gets you thinking as a collective again, which is the entire work of the board. The places we go, I'll give you some resources here. There's maybe some time for quick questions. I don't know. It's places we go for guidance here. If there's more you need, let us know. Imagine Canada has the standards program. It's a certification program, but you don't need to go through that. You can actually look at the materials and say, do I have the policy, structures, and procedures in place for my board at the size I am? It's a really nice little tool to have, free to use at that level. If you want to do certification, that's up to you. The community development unit of the Alberta government has some great resources. They're largely based on Alberta materials. So there's some good stuff there. The board development program was the name. They're now in the CDU. The Professional Accounts of Canada, a huge number of resources there and all kinds of stuff. That's where I would go. Then board sources one. This is American, so this is the regulatory piece you got to watch. On things like group processes, meeting protocols, probably pretty safe. Anything regulatory, kind of take that with a grain of salt. But how boards work, board source is a great little source out of the state. All right. I'm done.
Good
Yeah,
job.
that
was great. We managed to pack so much information in that past hour. So thank you, Mike. I'll shoot one question because it's the question that comes up anytime we have a governance session. It's that question of how to shift from a operationally minded board to a governance or perhaps more strategic, larger thinking type of board. Probably not something you can sum up very quickly, but thoughts on that?
Sorry, say it again. From a governance board
So
to what?
shifting from an operationally minded
Okay, operates.
board to
Yeah.
governance.
Yeah, it's harder than you think. I think we sort of think, I think board's going to evolve from a working board or operating board to this purely governance model. It's tough because you can rarely, it's a big jump. You sometimes think if I hire an executive director, then I can download them. But usually if you have enough just hire an executive director, they still have tons to do. So you tend to sort of work on almost this hybrid model for a while. So you don't go from working board one day to governing board the next day, or governance board that next day. So you kind of got to stage it sometimes. I think it's going to get awkward because it's kind of messier, but the clearer you can be saying, we're giving away this much stuff right now at the executive, but we're keeping this much stuff. And maybe in a year or two from now, we've grown a bit more, we're gonna keep more to the executive. But to do it reasonably, it's not just to dump it on somebody's shoulders and say it's all yours now, because boards don't tend to give it all away anyway, and they say they come back. So do it over stages and be really super clear, almost pedantically clear about this is what we're doing, this is what you're doing, and then review it regularly and say, because a lot of people, a lot of organizations probably don't get really what they need in an executive or what they're going to do. So you got to test it over time, refine it. So do it regularly, go back to those roles and make sure it fits, and just be really open to the conflict because it will generate some conflict. So have good processes to use that conflict creatively. It doesn't be a bad thing, but when it's not clear and it's not defined, it lingers and you're sort of downloading expectations tends to fail.
Great. Okay.
There's a question I thought this started about chat about paying. Was there a question about paying?
Yeah, there's a question about, can the board be paid? And yeah, we'll start with that.
Generally not. Most bylaws will say board members should not be paid for their role as a board member. Now, you may have other roles that give some compensation, perhaps. So, but that's not as your role as a board member. So general practice is, no, boards are unpaid, they're voluntary. There are some structures that allow for an honorarium, perhaps sometimes. You got to be careful on that because you don't want people coming for the financial reward. This is the heart of being on a board is saying you're here. The government has said you are a public trust. You're doing good things for society. It's good to have volunteers running those things. So it's motivational. It's rarely done. If it's done, you can recoup costs. You can pay board expenses. That's not a problem if you have travel and meeting that stuff. But to be paid to be a volunteer, it doesn't work because you're not a volunteer if you're paid. So yeah, largely no. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think because there's so many different questions that do show up in the realm of governance. There's confusion over roles. There's many different types of governance structures. So that's why on the next few slides we do highlight other services that we provide and ways that we can really kind of dig down into everyone's specific questions. So some of the services we provide, it all starts with just shooting us an email or a phone call, and we connect you with Mike and we have conversations about how we might be able to support your board. Maybe that's just answering the very specific questions related to your organization, or maybe it's something deeper like any of these services on this slide right here. And otherwise, on our next slide, we have, we ourselves are a nonprofit and charity. So we like to do free chats, free problem solving sessions. And we're here to support you and help your organization operate better. So I do have a survey I'd like to distribute. We do really inform these offerings based on what comes through the survey. Let us know other questions you might have, other topics you might be interested in. I saw some really good input on, basic committee questions, or how do I, shift things in my board? What's this role? So please put that in the survey, and we'll get to that and reach out to you as needed. And just thank you so much to everyone for all your attention and your engagement today. Yeah. Go ahead,
Thanks,
Mike.
folks. Go enjoy spring if you can. Someday I'll be here. And then I'm gone. So I'll be short. Thanks for being here. Hope to see you next time. And always a pleasure to have you with us. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.